Greetings everyone, it is Zakes here and we are back with our weekly videos. This week we are talking about regulations. If you are a regular watcher of our videos here at home, you would know that this is something we are pretty opposed to, right? And if you have read any of the papers in our Liberty First series, you would know that we dedicated an entire paper on the regulatory state of South Africa and what we need to do to change our economic fortunes, specifically relating to deregulation. But we have to start by, as always, describing what it is that we're talking about. What are regulations? These would be laws, really, for lack of a better term, and my legal heads have to pardon me here by calling regulations laws, but these would be laws, edicts passed by the state at any level which seeks to govern economic activity in any jurisdiction, right? In South Africa, a typical example of regulation would be, for instance, let us just start with the most topical one, BEE regulations that dictate which percentage of a particular demographic you are supposed to have in a workplace, in employment equity, or these would be regulations in the labor sphere, right? Every single provision contained in the Labor Relations Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and any other form of legislation that you can think of. And as I said, they emanate from any level of the state. So a municipal bylaw saying, or zoning law dictating which type of business or activity can happen in a particular area is also included in the in the term regulations. And that is what we'll be talking about today. Regulations, that is what they are. And as you would know, here at the Free Market Foundation, we are pretty opposed to regulations in general. Personally, I am opposed to all regulation and all form of legislation, really, particularly when it comes to governing non-harmful activity between individuals, because I find that to be inherently unjust. And at a broader macroeconomic level in South Africa, we are actually seeing a case whereby the overregulation of our economy is the reason why we have been growing at levels that are really nothing to write home about, considering our unemployment levels. Over the past decade, we haven't skirted past 2% in growth, and this is due in large part to how static our economy is, how overburdened by regulation is, how companies have to spend a whole lot of money in compliance fees and making sure that they aren't foul of the law when hiring, when firing, even when disciplining certain employees, because of the level of regulation that is inherent just in the labor field itself, not to mention the actual industries that these companies operate in. And that is the reason why our economic growth rates, among many other reasons, of course, why it hasn't been as high as is needed. And I think this is a pretty topical time to be talking about the regulatory state of South Africa. The budget is currently being considered for the third time, right? So the Treasury Minister is, I'm sure, having sleepless nights. We hope he's having sleepless nights trying to figure out ways in which revenue can be raised. But here at the Free Market Foundation, if you remember, when we released our Liberty First series right at the beginning of the GNU, when we were all filled with hope about the state of the future, we recommended to the state about the things that it needed to do in order to create prosperity, in order to create growth. And if we had growth just this past year, I think that our budgetary and fiscal issues would have been addressed, because the tax base would have grown, and as such, as a consequence of that, revenue would have also grown, right? But as another solution that we will always offer to the South African government is they have to deregulate. The best way to grow the economy, which is, I'm glad most among the states have realized is needed, to get us out of this fiscal hole that we find ourselves in, thanks to large amounts of spending that has not been curtailed, something that we'll get into in another time, I'm sure. But the only way we can get out of our fiscal hole is if we grow our tax base, which has been shrinking over the past couple of years. And the best way to grow our tax base is to grow our economy, make sure people are employed and are generating things that other people find useful enough to be able to spend money on them. This is the only way to really arrest every fiscal problem that we have in South Africa. And it's seemingly the parties in the GNU, at least the biggest party in the GNU, is not willing or able to change their ways, especially concerning regulation. So we hope that whoever was a decision maker among them will be watching this video and be thinking, maybe we do need to deregulate. And what recommendations would you say the South African government needs to take from us here at the Free Market Foundation? Well, we have a paper, as I said, that was written on regulation, which has recommendations about what the government has to do. And chief among them really is just removing things like collective bargaining and labor negotiations, right? Having the idea that people who aren't party to certain negotiations, as is the nature of collective bargaining, just because they're in the same industry, should also enjoy the same terms that were negotiated by other people at a different firm, in most cases than not, really undermines the dynamism that is needed in the labor market for it to be able to generate the amount of jobs that the South African government needs. But in general, there has to be a relooking of the overall labor legislative environment in South Africa, particularly the Labor Relations Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, specifically provisions that make it difficult for employees to hire and fire people. We have to get rid of regulations like the minimum wage. This is something that is pretty non-negotiable, especially if we have as high of an unemployment rate as we have in South Africa. Failure to get rid of the minimum wage would mean that we'd have to institute something that we are proud proponents of here at the Free Market Foundation, which is the Job Seekers Exemption Certificates, right? So this would help people be exempt from the burdensome regulations in the labor market. If you are an employee or a potential employee who is looking for employment in the South African labor market, you can then choose to be exempt from certain provisions of the Labor Relations Act and the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, so as to increase your chances of being employed. I think this is a pretty reasonable thing to argue for, given that we have a catastrophic unemployment level, one that is at disaster levels really, and it is quite disheartening that the government is still continuing to function like we aren't sitting with a literal ticking time bomb in terms of our unemployment levels. But those are the recommendations, just most specifically focused on the labor market, getting rid of things like collective bargaining, getting rid of onerous regulations in general, right? I like that the government has adopted this sort of thinking in certain areas with operations like Operation Vulindlela that can definitely go much more further, right? But that form of rhetoric emanating from the state is, of course, something that should always be applauded, but it can definitely go further. And, taking heed of these recommendations that I just mentioned here, particularly in the labor market, will help get rid of our unemployment problem, which would definitely grow our economy. And of course, if you are interested in learning more about these recommendations and the regulatory state in South Africa and what the Free Market Foundation thinks of it, you can go to Liberty First site, whose link is below in the description. You will find the paper there with the recommendations itself, and I advise you to read it if you have even a semblance of an interest in something like this, because it is pretty much worthwhile. And you will see how the problems we have aren't problems due to a lack of solutions, but they are problems due to a lack of political will in implementing the proper solutions. But that will be me from this week. Please do tell me, what do you think? I obviously am opposed to the regulatory state. I am not the biggest fan of it. I want, as I said, all regulations, legislation in general, not to exist, because it is an inhibition in liberty, and rights do not need legislation to be protected, not to be recognized. But maybe you're a proponent of the regulatory state. Maybe you see, something like the European Union and its behemoth of regulations and bureaucracy, and you want that, or at the very least you have a moral inclination as to why you are in support of regulations. Please do tell us what you think below in the comments. Give the video a like if you haven't as of yet. I don't know why, because I think I've been doing a pretty good job, right? So please do give the video a like, subscribe if you're unsubscribed, and share the video with all of your friends. And always remember, stay free.